You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast, produced in collaboration with the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. This week, we're talking about sugar. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we bring on a rotating panel of our science contributors to pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
Hi everyone, I'm Nguyen. I am a master's student in the experimental medicine program at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I study how physical exercise affects the development of the new immune system in bone marrow transplant recipients.
And I'm Joshua Conrad Jackson, and I'm a PhD student in the psychology department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I study how culture changes over time and the impact of culture on human psychology.
And my name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I'm a web developer, and I work on the Useful Science website. So, Uyen, let's dive into your article.
Yes, okay. So, kids love sugar and adults do too. Sugar makes us feel great right after we eat or drink something sweet, but eating too much sugar can make us more likely to have risky behavior, which puts us and others in harm's way. I'll present a study that correlates excessive sugar consumption and risky behaviors in teenagers in 26 countries. So the title of this paper is Adolescents, Multiple and Individual Risk Behaviors, examining the link with excessive sugar consumption across 26 industrialized countries. And the authors were Zlata Brukov at UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti in Florence, Italy, and Sophie Wolf at Bar Ilan University in Israel. So this paper wants to see whether there is a relationship between high sugar consumption and involvement in substance use and peer violence, and if so, whether this relationship is strengthened by low socioeconomic status and low psychological well-being. So this paper used data from the Health Behavior in School-Age Children, HBSC survey, a school-based survey focusing on adolescent health behaviors and the underlying factors which affect the nature or outcome of these behaviors. The BSC study includes nationally representative samples of school children aged 11, 13, and 15, and is carried out in over 40 countries in Europe and North America every 4 years. The final sample consisted of a total of 137,284 kids.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty big sample size.
Yeah.
And a big range too. So children were asked to indicate how often they consume sweets, candy or chocolate, or soft drinks that contain sugar. So these two items were then combined into a sugar consumption scale with values ranging from 0 to 14, so that high scores mean healthy eating habits, 0 denotes a negative outcome, consuming both sweets and sugar drinks at least once a day, and 14 refers to positive outcome, never consuming sweets or sugar drinks, which is quite unlikely. So to measure the frequency of risky behaviors, the study gathered participants' answer to 5 questions, which assessed how frequent they were involved in physical fighting, bullying other people, casual drinking, drunkenness, and smoking. So for physical fighting, they were asked, during the past 12 months, how many times were you involved in a physical fight? How often have you taken part in bullying another student? Have you drunk wine, beer, hard liquor, or any other alcoholic drinks? For drunkenness, they were asked, have you ever had so much alcohol that you were really drunk in the last month? And lastly, for smoking, they were asked, how many times have you smoked? The kids' socioeconomic status and psychological well-being were also assessed in the HBSC survey. So as expected, there was a progressive 2 to 3-fold increase in the multiple risky behavior rates between 11 and 15 years of age. Now, so for individual risky behavior, high sugar consumption was associated with regular fighting in 23 out of 26 countries. For drunkenness and regular drinking, after adjusting for mental health and life satisfaction, the significant relationship with high sugar consumption remained robust in 23 in 25 countries, respectively. Only in Sweden, and only the relationship between reported high sugar consumption and drinking was moderated by family socioeconomic status. Yet, the direction of this was contrary to what they were expecting. Young people with higher family affluence and higher sugar consumption were more likely to have multiple risky behaviors than young people with lower family affluence.
Might be good to explain what moderation is, just for people who don't come from a statistical background.
Yeah, so another way of explaining this would be how this association was strengthened by psychological well-being.
So it was stronger for people with higher well-being or lower well-being?
With lower well-being.
Okay. And so the relationship wasn't the same across high and low well-being, and it was stronger for lower well-being. So moderation is when a relationship is different for different groups of people or based on some other variable. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, that was a really good clarification. Okay, so where was I? Overall, adolescents in the group of high sugar consumption were 78% more likely to engage in multiple risky behaviors compared to the reference group. So the strongest associations were found in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Portugal. Their adolescents with high consumption of sugary drinks and sweets were twice as likely to engage in two or more risky behaviors as their peers. It's interesting to note that high consumption of sugary drinks was a stronger and more consistent predictor of multiple risky behavior than sweets and chocolate, since sugary drinks also often contain many additives, including caffeine. It is possible that sugar in combination with some additives in soft drinks makes them a more powerful and consistent predictor. So the study concluded that the relationship between excessive sugar intake and involvement in risky behaviors is relatively consistent across socioeconomic statuses and levels of psychological well-being.
It's a really interesting article, and thanks for summarizing it so thoroughly. I was wondering, well, when you were listing off all those risky behaviors, it kind of felt like sugar was something that could have been on that list, kind of because it's something that poses a health risk, just like drinking alcohol does. Did that strike you as something that, I mean, is sugar really substantively different from those other risky behaviors?
Oh, you mean like thinking of sugar as one of, right, instead of correlation sugar intake with those risky behaviors?
Well, I suppose that when you have a big correlational study like this, it could be that sugar intake is actually causing people to be more aggressive and to drink alcohol, or it could just be that people who are aggressive and drink alcohol also drink a lot more sugary drinks, even though they know it's not good for them. And I wondered what your take was on which of those possibilities was more likely.
Yeah, so that is like one of the limitations of the studies, that you can't really conclude anything causation from the study. But I do think that drinking a lot of sugar does change your brain biochemistry in a way. And this could, I wouldn't say make you, but in a way, this could kind of affect how you behave and partake in activities that may not be otherwise good for you.
Can we touch on the known behavioral effects of sugar? Like I've heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard the idea that sugar makes kids hyperactive is a myth. Maybe I've got bad information there. I know we're not talking about hyperactivity, but I'm curious, like, what effects sugar has on people, aside from the calories and the diabetes and stuff.
Yeah, so I think after you consume sugar, like you get like a surge of dopamine in your brain, which makes you feel like extremely happy. Yeah, so it kind of feeds into the reward circuit of the brain. And although I'm not a brain person, but that's what I've been hearing.
Is dopamine associated with risky behavior?
Well, people who are more sensitive to dopamine are more likely to engage in riskier behavior. There are two schools of thought with respect to the whole sugar hyperactivity idea. One is that there is an effect on hyperactivity just because it raises energy levels, but there has not been really conclusive evidence in favor of this. It's mostly just grounded in the idea that if you do have higher energy levels due to glucose intake, you should be more likely to be hyperactive. And then the other school of thought is that it's mostly in the minds of parents. So the fact that we know about this association leads to a kind of placebo effect where as soon as we might treat our children in a way that encourages hyperactivity by saying, oh, you've just had your sugar. I can't wait to see what happens next. Or it might even be an illusory correlation where parents think that a particular instance of hyperactivity is linked to the sugar that their children has just eaten, when really the kid would have been hyperactive anyway. And so I think the jury's out exactly on how much sugar actually makes kids hyperactive. But I think that one of the things that Uyen's study really shows is that sugar does seem to be part of this package of riskier behaviors where when kids are drinking sugary drinks and eating sugary foods that are bad for them, they are more likely to do a whole host of other risky behaviors. And so it indicates that, for whatever reason, they may not be regulating the kinds of things that are going into their body and what they're doing in and out of school.
Yeah, I guess rebellious kids are going to be rebellious, and eating junk food is a part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So should we turn to what you can do if you want your kids to stop eating sugar?
Wait, let me finish this off. Yeah, so what does this all mean? I think on a personal level, maybe keep our teenagers' consumption of sweets and Coke consumption to the minimum. Though I think it can be quite challenging to do that with chocolate. From the policy perspective, I think we need to have policies that monitor vendor sales in schools and other child-related facilities. And these policies could work alongside interventions focusing on peer violence and substance use.
Yeah, great.
Well, that's a good segue. I mean, let's talk about policy implications.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably everyone on this podcast at least can agree that sugary drinks and foods can be bad for you for whatever reason, whether it's just health-wise or whether it's behavior-wise too. And I think Nguyen's study shows that they're associated with effects that go beyond just your body. But can we really stop people from consuming sugar? It seems pretty difficult. Sugar is so delicious. I had a square of chocolate after dinner, and I might have another one after this podcast. But maybe we could do it. I mean, what would happen if we imposed a tax on sugar? Would people actually stop buying soda? I'll describe a study now that suggests that maybe they would, and maybe these kind of taxes would be effective. This is a study published in the British Medical Journal in 2016. It was authored by Arantxa Colchero, Barry Popkin, Juan Rivera, and Xuwen Ng. It's titled Beverage Purchases from Stores in Mexico Under the Excise Tax on Sugar-Sweetened Beverages Observational Study. Very descriptive title. And it begins with some depressing stats. Prevalence of diabetes in Mexico is among the highest in the world, and heart disease and diabetes are the two leading causes of death in Mexico. This is as of 2016. In 2012, perhaps when this study started, 72% of the population was overweight or obese, which I think is a pretty mind-blowing statistic. It's 3 out of 4 people are overweight.
Wow, that's wild.
I know, right? In 2013, the Mexican Congress passed an excise tax on sugar-sweetened beverages and a sales tax on several highly energy-dense foods. And this just means that the price went up for both of these types of products. Excise taxes are a little less direct than sales taxes, but they both mean that the price of the product that you're buying is higher than it would have been otherwise. So this was 10% higher for sugary drinks like sodas and juice from concentrate, and 8% for energy-dense foods containing more than 275 calories. The paper doesn't specify what that means, but I assume it's candy bars, similar types of snack foods. It doesn't really matter about the energy-dense foods because the study is focusing on sugary drinks because it's easier to track these type of purchases. And by track these type of purchases, I mean that they used something called the Nielsen Consumer Panel. This is a really cool survey technique where you pay people to scan the barcodes of the products that they buy, either using a smartphone app or a scanner that the company sends you. And you get money back for scanning all these barcodes. And using these data, the researchers were able to collect information on the foods that Mexican households in 53 cities bought, totaling 50,000 inhabitants. And they looked at the purchase of beverages by each household between January and the end of December 2014. And so this was the period of time that after the tax was passed, and they could compare it to purchases before the tax was passed in 2012 and 2013. And using these data, they could estimate the volume of each beverage category. So a beverage category could be carbonated soda, and break these volumes down by the categories that were taxed and the categories that weren't taxed. And so the categories that were taxed, as I mentioned before, were soft drinks, sweetened sodas, and the categories that weren't taxed were things like still or sparkling bottled water or juice that wasn't sweetened. They couldn't look at dairy products because this wasn't included in the Nielsen data. So these were the main comparisons. Any questions so far about that?
Nope.
No.
Cool. So they could compare these estimates of sugary and non-sugary drinks. And what was really cool is they could use the data before the tax to essentially project what the purchases would have looked like if the tax hadn't happened, and what they did look like because the tax happened. And so this isn't a causal study, but using these longitudinal projections, it's getting a little closer to causation than just a typical correlational study would have. And using these statistical models where they're able to project what the data would have looked like and compared it to what it did look like, they found that the average Mexican purchased 4,241 fewer milliliters of sugary beverages, as would be expected over the course of 2014. And this translates to about 7 20-ounce bottles of soda.
Over the course of a year, the average person bought the equivalent of 7 fewer bottles of soda.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so by contrast, the purchases of healthier, untaxed beverages increased through 2014. And so the average Mexican purchased 21,600 more 20-ounce bottles of something like water throughout 2014.
I mean, that sounds like a lot, but also I wouldn't be surprised if it's a drop in the bucket compared to how much sugar people are actually consuming.
So that's a good point. And what's even more helpful than these total volumes is looking at the percentages. And so 7 20-ounce bottles doesn't sound like a lot, but I don't know how often you guys drink soda. I hardly ever drink soda. And so it's larger than you'd think. And that's actually 12% of what someone would consume of sugary beverages. So that's a 12% drop in sugary beverage consumption over the course of the year. And then while that non-taxed number seems quite high, the 21,000 milliliters, that's a 4% increase. So the drop in sugary drinks is actually larger relative to what people usually do than the rise in non-sugary drinks.
Okay, got it.
Sorry, do people have to pay to drink water?
Well, we all pay to drink water when we buy a bottle of Dasani.
Why do you pay in a restaurant, for example?
Yeah. And so I don't think that they're looking at restaurants here. They're only looking at things that people can scan with a barcode. And so I'm assuming they're looking at purchases in grocery stores, convenience stores, etc., although they didn't specify in the paper.
I'm sorry, when you gave the number, you gave it as an equivalent of bottles of soda, but were we talking about just beverages? Like, was that the amount less sugar they drank in the beverages they were consuming, or is that total sugar consumption?
That was the beverage amount.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And so they're looking at volume of beverages. And it's actually a really good point because, of course, not all beverages are created equal. Some like Mountain Dew versus, I don't know, some like Smart Water. Both of those are pretty sugary, but Mountain Dew has a whole lot more sugar, I think, than Smart Water does. Kind of going out on a limb. But I'm not exactly sure. I think that maybe they were using that 20-ounce bottle just to show the volume, but they may have done more sophisticated analysis in their supplement to say exactly how many milligrams of sugar less. anyway, but I think that the 12% stat is the reliable one. And that's really, I mean, it's quite a big increase. And they actually follow that up with some analysis of household differences, comparing low, medium, and high socioeconomic status households. It's not clear based on the paper how they define these cutoffs, but if you take the cutoffs as they present them, they find that there was a 17.4% reduction in sugary beverages amongst low SES households, but this reduction was only about 5.5% for mid and high SES households. And so it was really people who were on the poorer end of their sample who were cutting down sugary beverage consumption. And so this is kind of interesting because it's sort of a double-edged sword, because you don't want people of any household status to be excessively drinking sugary beverages, and people in low SES backgrounds are particularly at risk for obesity and poor health outcomes. And so this is a good thing. But some politicians, including Bernie Sanders, actually has argued that this is actually evidence that taxes like this are making it more difficult for low SES people to shop for their foods, and it's hitting them disproportionately hard. And so we can't take this as a universally positive thing.
Yeah, any tax on food is going to be, by its nature, a regressive tax, because everybody eats the same amount of food, more or less. And if you're poor, that's a large percentage of your income, and if you're wealthy, it's a very small percentage of your income. So the poor people end up paying a larger percentage of their income in taxes if we're taxing things like food.
Yeah, and so, like I said, I mean, you can say that this is a good thing, but there's a sort of hidden cost to these taxes that are important to keep in mind. The picture isn't entirely rosy.
Well, you should tax the manufacturer, and then it could be an incentive for them to come up with formulas that have less sugar in them, but are still appealing to consumers.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not a legal scholar, and so I'm not sure if it's harder to tax manufacturers than it is to introduce excise or sales taxes, and why they chose this strategy. But all things being equal, that certainly seems like the preferable solution from a welfare perspective. Anyway, back to optimistic things. They round out the paper by noting that past studies of tax-induced changes in consumption show the highest rates of change after longer periods of time. And so the tax settles in, people gradually break their shopping norms, and then the largest results are observed a year or two after the tax goes into effect. And so they note that their results could be actually underestimating the impact of the 2013 tax, since they were looking at immediate consumption changes in a year following the tax. I actually looked around for some articles trying to extend their analysis to 2019 or 2020, but I couldn't find anything. And I wonder whether Mexico continued to see drops in sugar consumption. Some stats suggest that obesity's dropped 5% from 2013 to 2019, but this isn't a huge figure, and it could be due to factors other than sugary food and beverage consumption.
So they still have this tax going on, right?
I'm not 100% sure of that. This was an analysis that was published in 2016. The tax went into effect 2013, so since they didn't note that the tax had been taken away, I assumed that it was still in place then. But between 2016 and now, I'm not totally sure. I did actually look at whether there were similar taxes in the States today, and unsurprisingly, there is no nationwide tax on sugary foods and beverages, but there have been a few city-specific taxes. And one of probably the most famous one is pretty close to where you are, Cameron. It was a measure in Berkeley, Measure D, that taxed 1%, 1 cent per ounce of soda, energy drinks, and other sugary beverages, and it gave the money to the city. And so a study was published in 2016 that compared sugary drink consumption in Berkeley versus San Francisco before and after the tax, and found that there was a 26% drop in sugary drink consumption in Berkeley versus a 10% increase in San Francisco and Oakland, where the tax was not put in place.
Really?
Yeah.
If I go to buy a can of soda and it's 12 cents more expensive, I wouldn't think that would factor into my decision.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there are two alternatives. One is that just knowing that the tax went into place might be setting healthy norms. Like if the government cares enough to tax soda, that might make headlines and then people might change their behavior. The other possibility is that, I don't know, like the butterfly effect, small decisions accumulate, maybe something going from $2.80 to over $3 is enough to change a few people's habits, and that carries forward. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. They should use the tax to subsidize healthy food.
Yeah, I know.
So the average cost to consumers is the same.
That I think is a huge point, because the same goes with this Mexican tax, because we don't often think about what taxes go towards, and the study of the Berkeley tax actually found that it wasn't as large as the law suggested. A lot of that money was getting put back into it wasn't actually coming out of the cost, I think, because of some lobbying efforts. But even when the tax is effective, it seems very reasonable to put it back into foods you want people to eat.
So we tax cigarettes. I wonder if that's effective.
It is tremendously effective, actually. And countries like Australia have done great things with that tax. But the tobacco industry is one of the best industries at scaring people off these type of taxes. And so a lot of developing nations that have tried to emulate Australia have drafted these type of laws and then got litigation letters from tobacco companies that actually have a similar wealth, like GDP, to the actual countries that are putting these laws into place. So I forget the actual country that couldn't go forward because of the legal fees that would be involved. But yeah, these taxes are effective, but because of lobbying and how good corporate lawyers are, it's very difficult to pass them sometimes.
Wow. I thought a sugar episode would be uplifting, but we talked about
Yeah.
we talked about troublesome teenagers and politics.
I know. I need a bag of Airheads or something to lift my spirits after that.
I know, right?
Wash it down with some Dr. Pepper.
Boy, sugar sure is addicting, isn't it?
That's what, the neuroimaging evidence suggests. And Uyen noted this earlier, and she might have more knowledge of this than I do, but my knowledge of neuroimaging studies of sugar and salt show that many of the same brain areas that are activated during cocaine consumption or other addicting drugs are activated when you eat a cheeseburger or, have a chocolate bar. And so, a lot of the same neurotransmitters and the same chemicals that are involved in addictive substances that we typically talk about as addictive are involved in sugary foods.
Yeah, I used to be a pretty regular soda drinker, probably about 20 ounces a day or so. And I remember hitting the middle of the afternoon and craving it pretty badly to a point of distraction, needing to go and get a soda.
Yeah. After salty foods, especially, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was in college, so I'm originally not American, and in New Zealand and Australia, ginger beer is a really big beverage. And so this is like ginger ale, but a little stronger and sharper. And I petitioned the college to introduce ginger beer into its cafeteria, and it became one of the most popular drinks. And so I was so proud of getting this drink popularized, even though I'm sure it was terrible for me.
Well, shall we wrap things up?
That sounds good.
All right. Great episode. Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. We always appreciate your feedback. You can email us at podcast@usefulscience.org. You can find us on Twitter @usefulsci, where we also post pretty regularly new articles that go up on our website, get posted to our Twitter account. So it's a fun place to kind of follow along with what's new on the usefulscience.org website. You can find us on Facebook. Just search for Useful Science. And we also have a subreddit, /r/useful science, which is a good place to discuss podcast episodes. If you have any feedback you want to give us there or discuss it with other listeners. I want to thank our editor at the Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee. She does a great job. And the composer of our music, Solomon Krauss Imla. My name is Cameron Spencer. If you want to hire me for a web design project, you can find my website at lab43.com, lab43.com.
I'm Nguyen. You can follow me on Twitter at WonderUyen. I sometimes tweet about science.
And I'm Joshua Conrad Jackson. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh_C_Jackson.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.